Hello, my name is Christina Davis. I'm Director of the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations at Harvard University. I'm happy to welcome you today to join us for our panel on Japan's post-election policy agenda. For all of us who follow closely Japanese politics, it can seem as if no matter what happens, the LDP always emerges on top. Even in the face of a pandemic crisis, it would seem that nothing will unseat the ruling party. Although there was criticism about mishandling of the COVID pandemic, and this led to the resignation of Prime Minister Suga in September after just 1 year serving as Prime Minister, his successor as the new LDP leader, Fumio Kishida, has just won a new majority for the party in the election held October 31st. The LDP won a decisive majority of 261 seats out of 465 total. Its coalition, together with Komeito, now holds 293 seats. Now, this was down from the pre-election 305, but their largest opposition party opponent, the Constitutional Democratic Party, saw its seats fall from 109 to 96, in what was seen as a defeat that led to the resignation of the party chair. The Conservative Party, Nippon Ishin no Kai, Japan Innovation Party, increased its seats from 11 to 41 in what was seen as a surprising success. Overall, though, the election results hold on to more continuity for the LDP along with its Komeito coalition partnership. From the U.S.-Japan Relations Program, we were very happy to hear of the success of our former associate in the program, Hideshi Futori. He was elected in the Kanagawa 13 district for the first time in a dramatic victory over LDP Secretary General Akira Amari. Congratulations to Futori sensei. To help us understand the significance of this election, we are fortunate to have a panel of the leading experts on Japanese politics. I would like to now introduce our three panelists who will discuss the election results and the Kishida administration policy agenda. First, we will have Ko Maeda, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of North Texas. Professor Maeda has written many articles on electoral institutions, party politics, including publications in the Journal of Politics, leading journals of comparative politics, and a recent study on the durability of the LDP Komeito government that was published in the Japanese Journal of Political Science. He will be presenting for us today analysis of the most recent election results. Our second speaker, Daniel Smith, is well known to us all here as our colleague of many years and a longtime supporter of the program. Professor Smith is now the Gerald L. Curtis Visiting Associate Professor of Modern Japanese Politics and Foreign Policy at Columbia University. He is the author of Dynasties and Democracy, The Inherited Incumbency Advantage in Japan, important today as many incumbents won in the most recent election. He also has really exciting new paper that just is coming out from the American Journal of Political Science that analyzes Japanese parliamentary speech records to explain accountability relationships between politicians and the bureaucracy. So I encourage you to read this new paper. He's also one of the leading editors of Japan Decides, which is the series of books that provides analysis of Japanese electoral politics. Today, he's going to share with us his latest research from a new survey analysis that explores the extent to which policies matter to Japanese voters and how these policy preferences interact with party labels. Our final speaker, we welcome Sheila Smith, the John E. Merow Senior Fellow of Asia-Pacific Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She also serves as a key leader on the U.S.-Japan relations through her work as the chair of the Japan-U.S. Friendship Commission and is adjunct professor at Georgetown University. She is the author of Japan Rearmed, Politics of Military Power, Harvard University Press in 2019, and also Intimate Rivals, Japanese Domestic Politics and a Rising China. She will be speaking with us today on the Kishida administration's foreign policy agenda. This seminar with three leading experts is brought to us by the sponsorship of the special series of the Policy Innovation in Crises, which is supported by a grant from the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership. Before we begin our presentations, I'd like to remind you, we have another seminar coming up next week on Japan in an Era of Uncertainty, looking at it from a cartoon perspective with a little lighter note. Mr. William Steele, Professor Emeritus of International Christian University, will join us with Andy Gordon as the moderator. And I'd like to remind you of our etiquette to please keep your microphone muted. And after the presentations are done, we will invite you to ask questions, which you may write in the chat or you may raise your hand button. Now let's begin with Professor Maeda. Lead us off.
Thank you, Christina, for a kind introduction. And let me do a screen share. Okay, hello to everyone who is watching this event. I am Maeda from the University of North Texas. I'm going to talk about the election results. Okay, so this graph shows the total allocation of seats right before the election and after the election. The ruling coalition of the LDP, shown in red, and Merow in orange, reduced their combined seat share, but they were able to stay in power. They don't have a 2/3 majority, but they have a lot more than a simple majority. Now, the largest opposition, the CDP, shown in blue, worked with some other opposition parties in candidate nomination. They did so in order to avoid having their candidates fall together, and they hoped that their unified candidates would attract the anti-government voters. So the opposition parties worked together, but both the CDP and the JCP lost seats compared to what they had before the election. So who gained seats? The green color in graph, that is Nippon Ishin no Kai. I will just call it Ishin from now. This is an opposition party, but it did not work with other opposition parties. And it is a conservative party. So it is ideologically separated from the rest of the opposition parties. Ishin's gain is probably the biggest story of this election. Last year, when there was a reconfiguration among opposition parties and the CDP emerged as the clear main opposition, it seemed at that point like Japan's party politics would have a structure of a bilateral competition between the coalition and the CDP. But with Ishin's rise, it is looking more like the beginning of a new era of a trilateral competition. Now let's see the results of the single member districts. Out of the districts, the LDP Merow coalition won in the last election. They were able to hold 177 districts, but they lost 49, which were all LDP's districts, no Merow's. So the LDP lost a little over 1/5 of the districts it won in the last election, which is pretty big. The LDP usually keeps 90% of its districts. So this time was different. And that's another reason why I say this may be the beginning of a new era. The LDP's losses happened both in junior members districts and senior members districts. There's no statistically significant difference. The LDP's losses happened slightly more in urban areas than in rural districts. But the LDP's loss was mitigated by its new gains of 21 districts, and also the party's gain of 6 seats in proportional representation. Okay, then next, Ishin. Ishin nominated its candidates in 94 districts this time, twice the number from the last election. It held all 3 districts it won the last time and gained 13 new districts, 11 of which came from the LDP. In its stronghold in Osaka, they nominated 15 candidates and all of them won. The CDP and other opposition parties, including opposition-leaning independents, held 36, lost 24, and gained 35. This diagram shows how the districts flipped among the coalition, Ishin, and CDP, and others. So there were a lot of exchanges between the coalition and the CDP plus others. Ishin only gained and didn't lose, but again, it only had 3 seats to keep. The 16 seats Ishin won in SMDs are only in Osaka and Hyogo, its strongholds. Whether it can become stronger outside of that region or not remains to be seen. Okay, these two histograms show the margin between the coalition's candidate and the leading candidate from the opposition parties, excluding Ishin, in individual districts. A vertical bar is drawn at 0, and the right side from there, shown in red, are the districts where the coalition's candidate won more votes than the top candidate from the opposition other than Ishin. The left side from 0, shown in blue, are the districts where an opposition candidate obtained more votes than the coalition. So the two graphs look similar, but we can see that there were more competitive districts near the 0 line in 2021 than in 2017. I also looked at individual district changes between the two elections to see what kind of districts had what change. A simple regression analysis reveals that the opposition gained more in urban districts than in rural districts. Also, in districts where opposition parties other than Ishin had multiple candidates in the last election, but had a unified candidate this time, the opposition had an average gain of 3.9 percentage points of votes in a single district. But it is also possible that opposition parties coordinated candidate nomination in districts where they thought they would do well. So we shouldn't simply accept that number, 3.9 points, as the true effect of opposition coordination. Also, that number is an average value. There's a pretty big variation across districts. Now moving on to PR. This graph shows the PR vote change of the parties from the last election to this election. In 2017, there is a party shown in a light blue color that won 17.4% of votes. That is the Party of Hope, which doesn't exist anymore. Where did the party's votes go? Did Ishin gain from them? Because Ishin is the clear winner of this election. Actually, it doesn't look like it from a simple correlation analysis. But anyway, Ishin more than doubled its vote share. Did that hurt the coalition or the opposition? There's no simple answer to that question either. In this graph, the y-axis is the Ishin's vote change from this election to last election to this election. So in all but one prefecture, Ishin gained votes from the last election. They gained a lot in several prefectures like Hyogo, Osaka, and Nara. Now the x-axis is the LDP's vote change minus the CDP's vote change. So a higher value means the LDP gained a lot. Hiroshima is there, probably because of the new Prime Minister Kishida, whose district is in Hiroshima. And lower values on the x-axis means the CDP gained relative to the LDP. Overall, this graph has a triangular shape. The prefectures where Ishin won a lot are generally located near the middle on the x-axis. So it looks like Ishin's growth didn't hurt one of the two major parties, but most likely both of them. Okay, and many people are talking about the possibility that the CDP lost PR votes because it worked with the communists. I cannot comment on that question at this point because I don't have enough data. Okay, and then women's representation declined from 47 in the last election to 45. Female winners of single-member districts went up by 1, but 3 fewer women were elected from proportional representation. Broken down by the parties, the women in the LDP remain unchanged at 20, and the CDP 1 more. But considering the sizes of the parties, the CDP has much higher percentage of women than the LDP. One last thing I want to say is what Ishin's rise will mean for the future of the LDP-Komeito coalition. It is well known that Komeito has been resisting the LDP's ambitious proposals, such as a constitutional revision, which requires a 2/3 majority. The LDP's right-wing supporters have been frustrated, and now that Ishin is bigger than Komeito, they are saying that the LDP can now dump Komeito and should work with Ishin to pursue big goals such as a constitutional revision. Okay, a 2/3 majority in the House of Representatives is 310. LDP plus Ishin, no Komeito, have 302. Plus, the Democratic Party for the People, which is closer to the LDP ideologically than the CDP, has 11 seats. And there are 4 independents who seem to be pro-LDP. Including all of those, a 2/3 majority is possible without Komeito. But I want to point out 2 things. First, for a constitutional amendment, 2/3 majorities in both houses are necessary. And in the House of Councillors, it is impossible, just impossible, to reach a 2/3 majority without Komeito seats. And second, as my co-author Adam Leaf and I have demonstrated, many single-member district candidates of the LDP heavily rely on Komeito's votes in their election, which means if the LDP loses Komeito, it's not just about the 32 seats of Komeito, but also about dozens of the LDP's own seats. So I don't think the LDP will stop working with Komeito. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Ko. That was fascinating overview to show even if LDP stays on top, there's actually much more nuance in where they won and lost, and you can read the future potential for change. Thank you so much. Now I'd like to turn to Dan.
Hi, yes, thank you for inviting me to participate in this really exciting panel. My name is Dan Smith. I'm the Gerald Curtis visiting associate professor at Columbia University, and I'm going to present the results of a survey experiment that I conducted during the course of the campaign with collaborators Yusaku Horiuchi from Dartmouth and Shusei Eshima from Harvard University. So as we all know, there's been a period of time, quite a long period of time, in which the LDP has dominated Japanese elections. The only election in recent years that the LDP has decisively lost is the 2009 election. And this is true despite electoral reform in 1994 that was in part designed to encourage 2-party alternation in power. If we look at support for the LDP versus support for the cabinet, we see that over time, support for various cabinets led by the LDP varies. There tends to be a declining level of support over the course of a cabinet's lifespan. But support for the LDP as a party is rather stable. Since 2013 or so, the LDP enjoys between 35 and 40% support qua party, which is not a majority of support, but higher than all of the other opposition parties. There's many explanations in the literature and in popular media for the LDP's dominance. Some people point to the organized vote, which would include also the organized vote of Komeito supporters, as Ko reminded us in his presentation, and the electoral alliance where the LDP gets support from Komeito voters in most single-member districts, and in return, some of the LDP supporters are instructed to vote for Komeito in proportional representation. Other explanations are the LDP has a credibility advantage, that for Japanese voters, there's a sense of there is no alternative, particularly after disappointing 3 years of government under the DPJ. Finally, the opposition is fragmented and remains fragmented. And one of the reasons why the JCP and the CDP and other opposition parties tried to coordinate candidacies in the most recent 2021 election was the idea that this was splitting the anti-LDP vote and handing the LDP and Komeito easy victories in single member district contests with just the plurality of support. In this project, we focus on policy voting and look at the extent to which the LDP's success over the past several years can be attributed to voters' actual support for its policies, separate from their credibility advantage or party label. We conducted a survey experiment called the Conjoint Experiment. During the course of the campaign, our sampling period was from October 19th to October 30th. The election day was October 31st. We worked through Qualtrics online panels. Our sample size is about 3,700 Japanese voters. We used quotas to get a roughly representative sample of the population based on demographics, and included various quality control checks to make sure that our respondents were answering sincerely. As I mentioned, my collaborators for this project are Shisei Ashima and Yusaku Horiuchi, but it builds on prior surveys in 2014 with Teppei Yamamoto at MIT and 2017 with Shiro Kuriwaki at Stanford, where we find similar effects. These are the manifestos of the 6 main parties that contested the 2021 election. And if you look through the manifestos, there's quite a bit of detail. But in our reading of the manifestos and also the policy issues that were discussed during the course of the campaign, we came away with 5 major policy issues that parties took positions on. Here are 3 of them, and this is an example of the way that the media portrays and condenses policy positions of parties for voters to consume during the course of the campaign. Here we have on the leftmost column the 6 major parties: LDP, Komeito, CDP, JCP, Ishin, and Democratic Party for the People. And then in the 3 columns to the right are 3 of the main policy issues: the coronavirus policy, economic policy, and security, national security and defense. For our survey, we added, in addition to those 3, nuclear energy and diversity or a symbiotic society, social policies. And we presented respondents with this kind of hypothetical table of 2 parties, party 1, party 2, where the contents of each cell are the actual real world positions of the 6 parties, but randomized and presented as hypothetical manifestos on each of these issue areas: nuclear power and energy, diplomacy and national security, diversity and symbiotic society, coronavirus, and economic policy. And then we asked each respondent, which party would you support, party 1 or party 2? For the LDP, the LDP's positions for coronavirus were to disseminate oral medicine by the end of the year, amend the law to curb flow of people when a state of emergency is declared. On economic policy, they wanted to have financial support of an unspecified amount for non-regular workers, women, household with children, and students, and so on. For diplomacy and security, most notably, they advocated for increasing defense spending to up to 2% of GDP and obtaining the capability to intercept missiles outside of Japan's territory. On nuclear power and energy, LDP is one of the only parties that supports restarting nuclear power plants whose safety has been confirmed. And on diversity and symbiotic society, the LDP supported parliamentary legislation to promote understanding of LGBT issues, but they offer no position on separate surnames for married couples or same-sex marriage. So here are the main results of the survey. This is we call this an airplane plot. So for each issue area, the LDP's position is taken as a baseline, and the points are the change in the probability of a hypothetical manifesto being chosen when it features that policy. So points to the left reflect policies that are more popular than the LDP's. Points to the right are less popular than the LDP's. Points to the right are policies that are more popular than the LDP's. For COVID, an interesting finding for our survey was that the CDP's position of advocating quarantine of 10 days for international visitors was less popular than the LDP's position and the other opposition parties. On diversity issues, all of the parties took positions in favor of separate surnames, and several of the parties also favor same-sex marriage. These positions are all more popular than the LDP's position opposing those social policies. On the economy, Kometo's policy was the least popular, to provide 100,000 yen worth of benefits for children from 0 years old to 3rd year of high school. Other parties who advocate for lowering the consumption tax have more popular policies than the LDP's. On energy, most of the opposition parties oppose restarting the nuclear power plants, and that's a popular opinion relative to the LDP's position of restarting nuclear power plants. Finally, the least popular position for national security is the Communist Party position to abolish the Japan-US Security Treaty. The next step is we added party labels to these hypothetical manifestos to see what would happen if our respondents then had the choice of partisanship. So rather than party 1 or party 2, for example, we showed LDP or Ishin in this example and asked, again, respondents which party they would support. Other than the party label, all of the policies included in the manifestos remained constant. Here's the headline results of this effect. So across all policy issues, even those issues that were promoted by the other parties, and even the JCP's position of abolishing the US-Japan Security Alliance, attaching the LDP party label increases support for the manifesto. So here we have without the LDP label and with LDP label for each of the 5 policy areas, and there's an increase in the probability of a respondent choosing the manifesto that has the LDP's party label. So what can we draw from this exercise? It's pretty clear from this experiment and the previous 2 experiments that we've conducted in 2014 and 2017, the voters' policy preferences are not necessarily connected to their party choices in elections. There's a strong party label effect, which could reflect the LDP's credibility as a governing party or some other kind of structural advantage. And LDP dominance is likely to continue, despite the fact that voters do not necessarily support the LDP's policies. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan. That's an incredible amount of information in a very concise presentation, really highlighting the importance of party label as distinct from policies, which is a fascinating agenda we need to think more about. And of course, among the issues that appears in your agenda is foreign policy. And for this, we're going to continue the conversation with Sheila.
Thank you, Christina and Shin and everybody for inviting me. This is a fantastic panel, and I'm still digesting both Ko and Dan's presentation. So, but let me talk a little bit about what I was looking for and what I was watching. And my story begins not with the lower house, but actually with the LDP leadership race, which I think was very interesting for us defense and foreign policy watchers. So let me start there a little bit. Obviously, a lot of estimation of Kishida-san and the Kishida cabinet draws on the idea that Prime Minister Kishida is in fact a dove. He is in the more cosmopolitan, diplomatically oriented wing of the LDP, and he was countered or he was contested in the leadership race by somebody quite obviously on the right, or the more muscular version of LDP policy, which was Takaichi Sanae, who obviously had the backing of former Prime Minister Abe. The interesting part for me in watching the leadership race, especially now that the lower house, at least technically, has been won, even if Ko is suggesting maybe it's not fully won, is the role that defense and security issues could play in the future politics of Japan. And I say that not as somebody who sits in Washington, but from somebody who has watched over time, candidates have not really, even in the LDP, run on a robust or as robust defense position as the LDP presented in this party, in this leadership race. So a couple of things about Takaichi, not just that she is representing the right wing, but that her ideas on the military piece in particular were very explicit. So 2%, Japan's defense budget should be 2% of GDP, given the dangerous neighborhood. Now, she was quite coy in a way because she equated that to the NATO defense budgetary goals. So she had a framing of we should be like NATO, devoting more to hard power. She also, in the debates, identified herself as a proponent of placing American intermediate range forces, missiles, on Japanese soil, something that usually even people who like those kinds of ideas don't use in a campaign for leadership of the party. But I think it's also important to note that Kishida-san himself, early on when he came out to challenge former Prime Minister Suga, put himself on the record as supporting some kind of offshore defenses. He didn't use the term conventional strike. He didn't use retaliatory capability, but he implied that he was very much in line with the defense group inside the LDP that thought Japan had to take a serious look at the efficacy of its missile defenses and perhaps add more firepower to what they had. So already in there, you've got the dove and the hawk labels at inside the LDP, a little murkier and a little different than usual. The electoral manifesto, of course, got handed over to Takaichi Sanai. And so the 2% of GDP goal went into the campaign manifesto for the party going into the election. But none of the other weapons-related issues, the very explicit weapons-related issues, were in that manifesto. Interestingly, if you're in the nuts and bolts, it didn't get into the small pamphlet that got handed out to voters, right? So the defense issues were in the larger campaign manifesto of the party, but not necessarily the first line of what the voters would see when they were out and about. How this melds then into the lower house election for me, I was drawing on the NHK candidate survey. I think some of our speakers also were looking at that as they were thinking about the lower house election. And here the defense spending answer was really quite clear that a large proportion of the candidates who are running for office, and I think Dan has pointed this out in his research, his collaboration on the survey of candidacies, 60% of the 834 candidates who responded to NHK's survey said that they thought that the defense budget not only had to go up beyond what it was today. They didn't say how far up, but they certainly said yes. Not surprising, maybe, but I think, it's certainly not surprising that the LDP supported this position, but a large number, almost all Komeito members said the same thing, as did Ishin no Kai, as our other speakers have pointed out. So you've got a consistency here in messaging by the candidates on the defense issue, specifically on defense spending in particular. It's very hard to gauge whether this affected voter behavior, and I'll leave that to, there's others on the participant list in our discussion today who might want to have a perspective on that. It's very hard to gauge. You can look at media polling, you can look at cabinet secretariat polling on attitudes towards defense, and you can certainly see in the last decade that more Japanese are responding positively to the idea that they perceive greater threat to Japan from outside. But it's very hard to get it as precise as you needed to get it to say whether voters were responding to defense needs. But let me say a little bit about what I think post-Abe politics what we need to consider in the defense and foreign policy realm in the post-Abe era. And the first and the most obvious one to this group is that, Abe Shinzo enjoyed a 2/3 majority in the lower house. And that gave him considerable, a very strong legislative foundation to put through a whole host of reforms, especially in the defense and security realm that mattered to him. So you get a lot of credit to Abe for being hawkish on defense, pushing an agenda, but I think we often underestimate the extent to which that 2/3 majority in the lower house allowed legislation such as the secrecy law, the counterterrorism law, and then obviously the 2015 batch of new security laws based on the reinterpretation of the Constitution. Now, Kishida-san, unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, is going to be facing some quite significant decisions. And he may not be Abe, and he may not have the underpinning or the legislative foundation upon which Abe could move the needle on Japanese defenses. But let me just talk about a few of the things that are coming up. He will be presiding over a new national security strategy next year. That will also be accompanied or slightly followed by a national defense program guideline, which is a 10-year defense plan. And with that, a 5-year procurement plan to implement that plan. Now, none of these things are legislated. In other words, they don't have to go to the Diet for approval for the policies, but the defense budget certainly will attract Diet attention, legislative attention. And so there will be some effort to rationalize whatever is coming in terms of increased defense spending going forward. He is also, assuming he lasts beyond next summer's upper house election, he is also going to preside over the question about conventional strike. And I don't see any way that this is an issue that Japan is going to want to kick down the road much longer. In other words, the ballistic missile defenses that are to be strengthened, the idea here is it's not just simply in buying sophisticated missile defenses, it's also should Japan add a conventional strike capability in some form or another, missiles or other platforms that will allow it to reach out and touch neighboring countries who might be threatening Japan. I don't see that this is a conversation that many people want to postpone, and certainly in the US-Japan alliance, this is on the top of that agenda. Finally, and this is a difficult one, it's not just defense, it's also in the foreign policy realm here, and that is how Kishida is going to move the diplomatic relationship, but also the security relationship forward when it comes to China. There was a huge interview with Kishida during the LDP leadership election. He very firmly placed himself on the side of being worried about Chinese behavior and about the challenge to Japan's values and of the authoritarian attitudes and behaviors of China. So he has quite clearly identified himself as seeing China as Japan's existential threat. There's a short-term question about Taiwan. And here the United States and Japan are scheduled to have a second, what they refer to as the 2+2 meeting. Because of Japanese politics, that'll be postponed, I think, to the new year. But nonetheless, this is the moment at which the United States and Japan will probably kick off discussions on how to think about a US-Japan coordinated role should the worst case outcome of some kind of use of force against Taiwan should take place. So I think there is plenty here for Mr. Kishida to preside over that could be problematic. Not all of it in terms of policy will have something to do with the parliamentary process in the Diet. But it does matter for those of you who watch the link between the electoral outcome and policy on these difficult issues, that the 261 number is really pretty critical here. And that is the LDP maintains control over parliamentary process to the extent that they can appoint committee chairmen across committee chairs and largely create, not create, but at least set the agenda for the Diet Affairs Committee. So you still have an LDP that is able to set the table, so to speak, in Parliament when it comes to issues that need, policy issues that need to be legislated. Let me, in conclusion, say a couple words because we now have a new Kishida cabinet. And the interesting thing there is really for me is the Japan-China relationship set up. And again, lots of anticipation or media speculation about hawks versus doves in the Kishida cabinet. I don't find that particularly useful labeling, but the foreign minister is Hayashi Yoshimasa, which many of us on the screen as well as on the call know well. He is being described as a dove when it comes, or a pro-China politician, because he has led the Japan-China Parliamentarians League. His father, of course, did that before him as well. But a new position was created, which is a human rights advisor to the prime minister. And this is Nakatani Gen, who is a former minister of defense and quite hardline on China. He particularly calls out Chinese behavior in Xinjiang as well as in other places as well. So you've got a kind of interesting balancing act in the personnel choices of the Kishida cabinet, suggesting to me in conclusion that the party balancing act behind the prime minister is really going to be central to figuring out how to navigate his foreign policy agenda. And I think the timing of many of the defense decisions that require Diet approval will wait for a post upper house election outcome that will position the LDP in a much stronger place to carry through some of these military or defense changes. Thank you, Christina.
Great, thank you so much. It certainly did seem that foreign policy was important in this election as more North Korean missile tests and concerns about China were happening right in the lead up to the election. And there was discussion about this issue in terms of how did the cooperation with Communist Party by the Riken Minshito affect their chances. And I would be curious to hear from Ko how he thinks that electoral strategy, in combination with all of the foreign policy concerns, affected the outcome. And I like, Sheila, your comment about balancing between hawks and moderates within this cabinet. But it is also interesting to think of the Japanese electorate that was supporting an increase in defense spending, but their concerns for moderation vis-a-vis China and upholding the peace constitution meant that even with a 2/3 majority, Prime Minister Abe, over his long term in office, did not achieve major shift in Japan's military posture. Certainly significant changes you highlighted, but he was restrained because the public is known to favor a more defensive posture and diplomacy first approach. So I do wonder what you think in terms of overall, is the foreign policy push hawkish or dovish, or do we see the same balancing act in the opinion of the public? And to Dan, you had so many interesting issues, but the one you left off was trade. And it is an interesting question in the sense of American elections have turned with such high profile to the backlash against trade integration. And the stability in Japan has actually upheld a pro-globalization policy orientation. And I am curious about whether none of the parties put trade on the agenda and that consensus itself backs what the public wants, or is that just a strategic choice? Anyways, those are a few of my questions, and the audience will also have many questions, but I'm going to lead off with two from our associates. We have a first question from Jordan Hamzawi, postdoctoral fellow in the program on US-Japan relations. He received his PhD from the UC Davis and is doing research this year at Harvard on one party to rule them all, the return of party competition failure in Japan. I feel like I should have music accompanying the reading of the title. And Jordan, go ahead and ask your question, and then we'll go to our second question from an associate. You're muted, Jordan.
There we go. Can we hear me now? Yeah. So I had no ability to unmute myself. I'm sure there's a poli-sci thing we can work into that. But, so yeah, excellent. I have instead of like one robust question, I got 3 mini questions for each of you because I thought all of this was super excellent. So for Ko, you mentioned that competition for the CDP versus the LDP in the competitive districts got closer by 3.9 percentage points, which is certainly a closer election and can make a difference in a single member district. But I was wondering how often was it enough to like tip the scale, or was it like, oh, we got closer to almost winning but ended up failing? So was the LDP still kind of coming out ahead in those competitive districts systematically? Or was it actually, was it like a 50-50 shot between the two? And then as far as Hope going away and their vote kind of just not seeming to go anywhere, did you find that after CDP and Hope merged, do you think they were reaching the same voters, or were a bunch of those Hope voters kind of left off in the dust? I was just kind of curious if you could talk a little bit about that. For Dan, I love the conjoined analyses. They're so fascinating. And I love bringing policy into the equation for Japanese electoral competition. But there's always, for a long time, there's been the discussion of the LDP is like the policy chameleon, right? It has this, right of center general ideology, and it has policies on the books that aren't the most popular, but when it comes time to deliver, a lot of times they will go and kind of do somewhat popular things too. And so I was wondering if, as you kind of for some time looked at policy and how voters respond to that, do you think that there's a thing of voters kind of trust the LDP to just kind of do the things that they like in general and will not really go forward on the unpopular stuff, right? Like, oh, they want to restart nuclear power, but are they really, that kind of a thing. So just kind of talking about how the LDP manages the delivery of policy and not just the policy promises. And then for Sheila, this is something that I've been wondering a lot. We've had Abe for a long time, and Abe was seen as, he's kind of the a more right-wing LDP-er than some other prime ministers, and so we saw some foreign policy changes that kind of seem to push it. Now that we have Kishida, and as you talked about, he's the dove, he's so nice, but prime minister is not a king, and it is he is beholden to the party. So I was wondering how much you think that LDP backbenchers, influential members of the party, might be pushing for changes in foreign policy, changes in the security forces, and how important you think Kishida is in the equation, or is he even going to be something that's kind of stems the tide of the LDP as a party's kind of incentive structure? So those are my questions.
Hold your thoughts. I have one more set of questions, then we'll let you get a quick response. Next, we have Masataka Harada, who is an academic associate with the program on U.S.-Japan Relations and associate professor of Faculty of Economics at Fukuoka University. He's doing research this year at Harvard on the long-term consequences of destruction of local communities using the case of firebombing of Tokyo during World War II. Harada sensei, please go ahead with your question.
Thank you all for a great presentation. Here is my question. So in this election, Ozawa-san, Nakamura-san, Sakurada-san, Matsumoto-san, Ishihara-san, Amaris-san, Tsujimoto-san, and Hirai-san all lost in the small member districts. So I skip explaining what they did or what happened to them in the past, but is there any common mechanism to explain their defeat? Thank you.
All right, I'd like to turn to our panelists now, and you may choose to respond to a few of the comments, but we do have audience questions as well, so please be brief. Why don't you start us off, Ko?
Okay, yes. Just quickly to Harada-san, sorry, I don't have an answer to that question. It is possible that the voters are getting older, so the stable supporters who loyally voted for a certain candidate may be now too old. That's possible explanation, but I don't know that yet. And to Jordan, about the Hope's, where did Hope's votes go? I haven't been able to check the data carefully, but I see some indication that the CDP has been able to gain the votes. It is shown in the CDP's PR gains in Tohoku region, where the Hope did pretty well the last time. And also looking at the Saga, the prefecture of Saga, and they gained, the CDP gained a lot. So that's kind of good news for the CDP. About the opposition coordination, just quickly, let me show you this graph. Okay, I didn't show this graph, but okay, this plots the margin, the coalition opposition margin for the last election in the x-axis and this election y-axis, both. So then the 45-degree line is where the opposition and coalition didn't change. Then the marks, the X marks are the ones where the opposition did the coordination. So clearly we see that in those districts with X's, the opposition gained more this time, but it didn't reach that horizontal zero line where the opposition would defeat the coalition. So they were successful in some places, but originally the margin was too big. So I stop here.
Real quick, Ko, there was one other question in the chat for you from Adam about whether you were thinking about the Isshin no Kai relative to 2014.
Yes, good point. The Ishin didn't do well. It did very poorly in the last election, 17. So compared to that election, yes, Ishin gained a lot. But in 14, Ishin did pretty well. So compared to that election, now the PR votes Ishin won is not that great. But the Ishin did very well compared to any election in the past in the single member district. So that is a big change, I see.
Okay, thanks. Dan, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much for the questions. I'll start with my co-author Yusaku Horiuchi has answered some of the questions in the chat, but I'll add that in 2014 we ran a version of this survey experiment. TPP was one of the major issues of the campaign, and so we included it as one of the randomized policy attributes in our hypothetical manifestos. And in that year, in our experiment, the LDP's position on TPP was actually more popular than the opposition party's position on TPP. But as Yusaku mentioned in the chat, this year trade wasn't really on the election campaign agenda as a major issue. And interestingly enough, neither was constitutional revision as one of the major issues that the parties were pushing, whereas it had been in 2014 and 2017. To Jordan Hamzawi's question about whether voters actually take the LDP's policy position seriously. So it seems like to a certain extent, at least the LDP's supporters are willing to give the party a lot more flexibility with their policy positions because they're supportive of the party qua party. There's some partisanship or party label effect going on in our survey results in any case. What's interesting is that even for some, traditionally, issues that were traditionally anathema to LDP supporters, like abolishing the US-Japan Security Alliance, even there we see that LDP supporters are willing to pick the LDP manifesto that has this kind of issue that would be so contrary to their purported policy goals. The other thing that we find is, I didn't mention this in the presentation, but a third segment of tasks that we had our respondents do showed the same hypothetical manifestos and asked respondents to choose which one they thought was closer to what the LDP's positions are. So kind of which hypothetical manifesto looks more like what you think the LDP would propose. And one thing we found was that for manifestos that were perceived as closer to the LDP's, the effective party label was mitigated. It wasn't as strong of an effect because voters were maybe already thinking that manifesto looked close to the LDP's. And so there is some policy awareness, but the takeaway from our experiment would be that party label is enough to overcome that. The LDP has a lot of flexibility on the positions it takes, and it will still get the support of its main core voters. As Masa Harada's question about why so many incumbents lost in single member districts, there's some media reports that some of those incumbents had money scandals or other kinds of issues. And so there may have been some localized accountability by their supporters. But as with Ko, I wouldn't have a systematic answer for you.
Great, thanks, Dan. Sheila, in your response to the questions, we also have an addition from Amy Katowinick asking about your confidence that they are going to address the strike capability and why you think that is the case.
Thank you, Christina. Yeah, I saw Amy's question. So just a couple of very quick comments on the discussion so far. Remember, I'm not doing the kind of campaign electoral analysis going into the election and then afterwards that Ko and Dan are doing. But one thing I thought was really interesting about the JCP and the way the LDP campaigned against them this time is they didn't line them up necessarily just on the US-Japan alliance question. You saw people like then Secretary General Amari on NHK and other very big platforms. Even Konotaro got in the game of really equating the Japanese Communist Party with China. And as we know, historically, the Japanese JCP's relationship was more with Moscow than it was with Beijing, but they did a very effective kind of, let's just say, red baiting kind of strategy that authoritarianism, if you want Japan to look like China, then the JCP is who you want. And so I thought that was an interesting new twist. On Christina, on your question, the hawk and the dove, I'm using that label. I don't really like the label, but I think the public is an active constraint. The reason I don't like the hawk and dove, even when we're looking inside the LDP, is I think positions have changed because the policy questions have evolved. So it's not that Kishida is a dove or a hawk, but that he will confront a different China as prime minister, and his cabinet will have to make decisions based on a different constellation of global, coalitions than they did 10 years ago or 5 years ago. So what you're seeing is the policy decisions that Japan is now being confronted with are moving increasingly towards this question of how are you going to utilize hard power? Who are you going to align yourself with? Can you really straddle the US and the PRC as we get into this more intense strategic competition between the two? I think there's generally harder choices ahead of Japan because of the global context. But you're absolutely right. The public will have to support what the LDP wants to do and actually gets done. And you're absolutely right to point out that restraint when it comes to Abe. Even Abe's agenda, right, was constrained by public reaction to his attempt to move the needle. He did move the needle, but he didn't do it without restraint. And I think that's a nice way to put it. One small comment, and I won't rest on it too long, I'll get to Amy's question. And that is when we were talking about trade, I mean, going into the election, that really wasn't there, but coming out, again, back to this question of agenda, there's a whole new set of issues under the rubric of economic security that is now part of what we'll have to watch for, because it's not trade per se, but it has trade implications, right? And it's a lot of issues such as, will Japan adopt a sanctions act? What we call the Magnitsky Act, which is to punish individuals and corporations involved in behaviors that we don't like on the human rights side. That's under consideration. This is partly what Nakatani Gen will be working on. But there's also an attempt to see whether or not Japan should limit the sharing of technology by private actors with regimes that, i.e. China, with regimes that may use that technology to their strategic advantage. And that opens up a really big space for a contest between the state and business or corporate Japan, because there'll be real resistance to that, I think, especially by some of Japan's manufacturers. Amy, your question's a good one. It's been on the docket. Here's my answer to it. It started out as under Ishiba Shigeru when he was defense minister, as you know, as a conversation inside the MOD. Is strike capability inconsistent with Article 9? That then led to a government interpretation that no, it wasn't, because it was for defensive purposes, right? Then you saw it move to the LDP and the Defense Committee, and this was led by Onodera, again, former defense minister. When he came out, he led the ballistic missile defenses conversation inside the LDP under Abe, and that led to a conclusion that, in fact, Japan needed retaliatory capability to beef up its deterrent. It wasn't enough to rely on the strike capability of the United States, but Japan should add this aspect to make sure ballistic missiles were adequate. Ballistic missile defenses were adequate. So it's moved up the ladder, and now you see it emerge into a much more formal place, I think, in the cabinet and in the national conversation. I also think that Japan, there's going to be trade-offs in the budget. If they invest in, Aegis Ashore, which they rejected, right? If they invest in other kinds of capabilities, that really going to give them, forgive the pun, bang for the buck as a conventional strike. I think you're seeing the convergence here of a decision that's both budgetary, strategic, and a little bit of perhaps a little spicy hedging going on here, but I think Japan's going to want it, and I think there's support in Washington for it. So I think it's coming. So let me stop there. So we can. Did I not answer Jordan's question? I apologize.
We actually two more questions in the chat on security, which are looking at what about the role of South Korea in relation to the strategies vis-a-vis Taiwan, and what you think is going to be the best approach. And that question comes from Yusaku Horiuchi, professor at Dartmouth, and also from Yuki Shiraito, professor at University of Michigan, asking about the trade-offs between welfare spending and defense spending, where I'd also be curious about, Dan, your thoughts on this related to policy and opinion.
Do you want me to go, Christina? Sorry, do you want me to hit those?
Why don't we have you start, and then Dan and co offer a couple of comments, and we'll have to close because we're near our time.
Okay, I'll be very brief on the missile defense issue specifically. I would say that all those missiles flying that Christina mentioned in the during the campaign, it was the South Korean missile, the SLBM missile, that probably alerted the Japanese planners the most. And the reason for that is everybody who surrounds Japan has indigenous capability for missile production, except for Japan. And so a larger, leaving aside ballistic missile defenses and what's best tactically or strategically, Japan doesn't have an indigenous capability on the weapons production capability on the level of its neighbors, even South Korea. And so I think there's serious thinking here about how to invest in long-term strategies that will allow Japan not only to use its technology, but also to build indigenous capabilities. So that's the piece on the ROK side I think is really important. I don't think the ROK plays a particular role in shaping Japan's Taiwan response, but I do think that what Japan's military operational strategy has been so far with the United States, it's been largely based on a Korean contingency. And so there's all kinds of new questions that will come up, which we can talk about another time, when it comes to Taiwan, because those are not operationally the same questions. They have to do with base use, weapons systems, use of force, who goes first and who goes second. There's a whole bunch of questions in a Taiwan contingency that would raise new things for a Japanese cabinet to discuss, both on the civilian side and on the military side.
Thanks. Dan, can you offer your thoughts?
Just on domestic spending, all of the parties proposed an increase in domestic spending. From our survey, it looks like the positions of the Communist Party actually that advocated focusing on spending to strengthen the middle class, but also lowering the consumption tax back to 5%. And Ishin and the Democratic Party for the People were the most popular in the abstract, detached from party labels, whereas the Komeito policy of spending predominantly on children was less popular compared to the other parties' positions, or families with children, and that may be because of different demographic groups in Japan. Fewer families with young children, perhaps, than among the electorate, or at least among our sample of respondents. But there did seem to be support for increased social spending, and not necessarily opposition to increased defense spending.
And Ko, you get the last word.
I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Although, of course, you showed such detailed analysis of party differences. And one of the funny stories of this election was people writing in Minchito, and it was allocated across two different parties that had different names.
Yeah, that was a strange story, really.
So we'll have to have new analysis of what are people really thinking, and why does it have a write-in election system that allows people to make mistakes in what they write in?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
But understanding the Japanese election is so important. Really consequential policies about dealing with the pandemic, allocation of spending, and of course, the looming foreign policy issues that will be important, not just for Japan, but for all of us as East Asia confronts a new era ahead. So I really appreciate you all taking the time to join us and help us understand why the election outcome reached this conclusion, both in terms of the party balancing and voter responsiveness to party labels, and thinking about the future agenda ahead in foreign policy. So we really appreciate your comments. It's been a great session. Thank you to the audience for your questions and for joining us today. We hope to see you again in a future program on US-Japan Relations seminars.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Wonderful program.
Thank you.